A parasha in the Torah is not just a chapter that happens to talk about a particular theme. Sometimes there are many themes in a particular parasha, but the name of that parasha represents all of those themes and the common thread that runs through them all. So it may well be that chronologically, last week's parasha and this week's parasha may be more connected than two parts of this week's parasha. But conceptually, thematically, all of the pieces of this parasha are very deeply connected together, and we have to understand what that common thread is. So when you look at Parashas Shmini, of course, you hear the Shmini, the eighth, well, that implies that there's something which comes before the 7 days of preparation in the previous parasha, before the Mishkan became live. Yet, at the same time, Shmini, 8, is a number which is completely beyond the here and now, beyond the ordinary, beyond the natural. And so, in this parasha, the overarching theme is actually going to be the number 8, that which transcends. And yet it's not said as 8, it's said as 8th, which means that somewhere in this parasha we have to see that which transcends the normal cycle of 7 is somehow linked to that cycle. And we'll see that play out in the fact that the parasha speaks about, on the one hand, these lofty ideals of the launching of the Mishkan, and on the other hand, such pragmatic, down-to-earth things like what foods you may not eat. And all of this is going to teach us a lesson that ultimately the purpose of Judaism is to bring the greatest holiness into the most mundane reality. In fact, not to bring it in, but to expose that it is already there. We're not in the business of superimposing holiness over the world. We're in the business of illustrating how the world, even in its darkest expression, is actually all designed only to express godliness. The Rebbe says, it's been explained many times, that the 53 separate parashas of the year, the way the Torah is divided up, even though each sedra, what we often call the parasha, has many sub-parashas, often on separate themes, the very fact that we have all of these chapters read in a single stream on a particular Shabbos under the name of a particular Sedra, that tells us that they are all linked and they all share a primary theme. Now, we have a golden rule which says that the Hebrew name, or more specifically the holy tongue name that is given to anything, tells us the essence of what it's all about. Move on. Whatever the central theme is of this entire section of Torah will always be represented by and illustrated in the name that is given to this particular Sedra. Now, sometimes you might find that the beginning of this week's parasha and the end of this week's parasha have less in common than, say, the beginning of this week's parasha and the end of the previous week's parasha. Particularly when you see that things are chronologically linked, because we know that smuchos, the fact that things are juxtaposed in Torah, is in fact a way to learn Torah. So the end of last week's parasha is not accidentally next to the beginning of this week's parasha. There will be a link there too. But if I look at, let's say, Rishon of the parasha and Shvi of the parasha, there might be a far larger gap in space, in time, and in theme. Nevertheless, we will see that the line that runs, the stream that runs through all of the events of the parasha are more strongly linked in the same sedra than they are in two consecutive pieces from two different sedras. So that's the general principle. Now we'll apply it to our parasha of Shmini. So we have to apply this directly to our parsha. Logically, the beginning of our parsha, which says, and on the 8th day, sounds much closer to the end of the previous parsha, which said the 7 days of preparation. That sounds a whole lot closer than, for example, the link between the 8th day of inaugurating the Mishkan and the list of kosher and non-kosher animals. Because logically, the 8th day follows the 7 days discussed in the previous parsha, yet it doesn't seem to have anything at all to do with the laws of kosher and non-kosher animals, birds, and fish. Move on. So, nevertheless, in spite of what appears to be the obvious link between the two parashas, Tzav and Shemini, we're going to say that there is a deeper connection between the beginning of Shemini and the story of the kosher and non-kosher animals that is even more profound than the connection between the 7 days of preparation and the 8th day of inauguration. And all of this, this is all going to be represented by and alluded to in the name of the parsha, which is Shmini. Now, let's just clarify for a second, even though we know the history, and we know that Shmini follows that there were 7 days of preparing the Mishkan, and now it's the 8th day, but when you look at it just in isolation, in this parsha, there's nothing about the name Shmini that tells you it is directly linked to the previous parsha. Again, there's nothing in the name of the parsha. Maybe the full sentence of the opening pasuk, maybe. But the name of the parsha does not illustrate any connection to the 7 days of Tzav. In fact, for that matter, the name of the parsha doesn't even tell you that it's an 8th day. It's just Shmini, 8th, without any specific association. 8th what? So move on. So that tells you straight away that the name Shmini is to illustrate the overarching concept of an 8th in any series rather than the specific 8th day of this series. Now, based on what we said earlier on in the Sikha, that you will see a greater correlation between the early and later parts of the same parsha than between this parsha and the immediately preceding parsha. Nimtza comes out, שפרשת כחס ארון מהסדר הקדמי ונגיע לנקודה המשותפת, רק הקדומה לשמיני, אבל אינו חלק משמיני. So then we have to say that everything we read about in the previous parasha, the 7 days that built up to Vayihi Bayom HaShmini, that was only preparatory, that was introductory. Now all of that introduction is complete, so a new entity is launched, a new concept is introduced, the concept of Shmini. It's very clear that that 7 day period is no longer and is not relevant now that we've moved to the Shmini. It's a new, fresh entity. As you can understand very simply, 7 days of initiating the Mishkan is only there as an introduction to the 8th day when it goes live for real. So, the 7 days of Miluyim from the previous parsha are introductory to Yom HaShmini, whereas the halachas of kosher, non-kosher animals, birds, and fish are part of the theme of Shmini. Now that we know that Shmini is a theme beyond just days, it's the concept of an 8th in a series, and we need to know what that means. V'yuvan. So in order to understand this, let's look at the paradox of the concept Shmini. So there are two very distinct differences between how you understand the concept of Shmini. On the one hand, the 8th implies that this is now a league of its own. There were 7 steps up until this point, and the 8th step leaps off into a different reality. Like the Kriya Yakar says in our parasha, that the number 7 will always relate to things that belong to the natural order, including the spiritually natural order, whereas the number 8 represents things that are unique to Hashem himself. Different category, different league of existence. So just to understand this a little bit better, it's not just that the number 7 represents all of the cycles of things that exist within the natural reality, be that the physical or spiritually natural reality, but actually the number 7 relates to the Eloikus, to the flow of God, the energy that causes nature to exist. Whereas Shmini represents a degree of godliness that is absolutely divorced from everything to do with creation and reality. It's a completely different, higher, exponentially so level. So on the one hand, Shmini represents something that's out of this world, and out of the spiritual dimension, and out of the created reality. On the one hand. On the other hand, it's inescapable. However, the minute you say 8th, you've automatically said this is not completely standalone. It's part of a series. In fact, you've highlighted by saying 8th that this follows the 7 steps of the original series, and it comes as a result of or following from them. So Shmini is paradoxical. On the one hand, it's totally out of the ballpark, beyond anything that we could understand in the Shvi'i reality. And on the other hand, it's a direct follow-on from the Shvi reality. And it's exactly this which is so unique about Shmini. In fact, this is why Shmini represents the truest form of divine revelation. Because the ultimate state that Judaism wants us to achieve is that the degree of Elikus, which is completely beyond anything natural, should be manifest in a revealed way within the lowest natural reality. Total paradox, like Shmini is a paradox. It's completely beyond and completely within simultaneously. מרומס בטבע שמיני, שתוכנו שגם מה שמובדל ונעלה מן הבריא, היינו מבחינה שיבה כנ"ל בכלי יוקר, יהיה באופן של שמיני השייך לבחינה זין לענייני הבריא. Now the word Shmini alludes to this. Shmini in a class of its own, and yet 8th of the series, related to the series, connected to the reality of this world. Now we need to understand exactly what that means, and we have to understand how, as we shall see, how this is not a superimposing of divine energy onto the world. That's why we're told that the harp in the time of Mashiach will have 8 strings, meaning to say 8 chords of music, which is different to the musical scale that we know now. As the Navi Yeshaya tells us that the ultimate goal of Mashiach is not just revelation of godliness, but that the physical eye will be able to see that godliness. The emphasis over here is not only that there'll be an immense revelation of godliness, but specifically that the human eye will be able to see it, which means means it's going to be a tangible, relatable, comfortable human experience, exactly as we see normal things now. In fact, it will be so impressive, it will be so powerful that it will actually become the most normal thing in the world. And by comparison, there were other times that Hashem revealed himself in the world, and it wasn't necessarily normal, and it was actually quite overwhelming. For us, in the time of Mashiach, seeing godliness will be as ordinary as seeing whatever it is that you're looking at right now. So this is an incredible insight, because we've heard a million times that when Mashiach comes, there'll be tremendous revelation of godliness. But now we're learning that it's not only that there'll be revelation of godliness, but that it will be normal. It will be part and parcel of ordinary human experience. It will not be mind-altering or mind-shattering. It will just be what we do. Pshittus, the most normal thing. Like you look at a tree swaying in the wind, like you look at your computer screen right now, so you will look at godliness in the time of Mashiach. Now, to understand that better, now there's another alternative, which is Hashem can do anything, and therefore Hashem could reveal himself in such a way that even your eye could see it. It wouldn't be natural to you, but you'd see it. That would be similar maybe to what happened when the Jews were walking through the Yam Suf. So, you see godliness. And it's not a common thing. It's like, wow, Marabet's boy. Start pointing a finger and saying, I'm seeing something I should not be seeing. I'm not even sure that I understand what I'm seeing, because it's an unnatural and, for that reason, temporary experience. When it comes to the time of Mashiach, it's not going to be that Hashem makes Elikus visible to humans. Rather, he wants it to be that it is normal for humans. So right? So if we're going to have an experience like they had at Har Sinai or like they had at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, they absolutely saw godliness, but it was a wow moment. So wow at Matan Torah that their bodies were flung back a distance of 12 kilometers and their souls popped out of their bodies. That's how wow it was. So Zeu Chidesh v'hisofa ba'olam kem cheras habasa es kved abaya einu mitzad tivoy. So any previous experience that we've ever read about or learnt about of revelation of godliness is there is the world, normal people, and then something is superimposed onto their experience, and suddenly their eyes are open to a reality which normally they wouldn't be able to see. So they're completely taken in the moment. It uplifts and inspires them completely, and then it ends and they go back to normal life where they start to see things again as you and I see them. So hapirush ha'amiti shel b'derech pshitus hu shiriyas habasar liyased es kved havayati mitzad tchunos v'teva habasar gufa. So what's going to happen in the time of Mashiach is not great revelation of Hashem only. It's a remodeling of the human retina that you can now perceive in a normal, natural way Elokus. And it will be no more surprising than the fact that you could look out and see a beautiful sunset. It's now part of my physical reality. Now, this is an incredibly important insight to appreciate that we're not looking forward to time in the future where Hashem just pulls back the veil and blasts us with divine energy. We're looking forward to a time where we resonate with that reality. It becomes normal to us. It becomes accessible to us. Which helps us to understand why the number that symbolizes the time of Mashiach, as in this expanded musical scale, is the number 8. Because the concept of being able to have divine revelation that the eye can see in the time of Mashiach, that itself shows us this incredible paradox, the radical paradox represented by the number 8. On the one hand, on the one hand, you're saying it's a revelation of Hashem's absolute power and energy, which the world should never be able to tolerate. Even the spiritual world should be unable to tolerate. And on the other hand, on the other hand, as the number 8 represents, it's part of a process, and part of that process means that it's comfortable. I'm at home. In other words, our experience at the time of Mashiach will be even greater than the experience of a Navi, because a Navi, as the Rambam tells us, has to first prepare themselves in order to reach the state of Nevuah, and even if they do reach the state of Nevuah, on a case-by-case basis, they have to get into the right headspace in order to receive the Nevuah, and even then, they have to strip themselves of their involvement in this world in order to receive the Nevuah. So that tells you that it's not actually a natural process, whereas in the time of Mashiach, it will be as normal, as ordinary, as looking at anything else that exists. So that's the paradox represented by the number 8. Totally beyond the world, totally beyond anything we could relate to, and yet completely relatable, all at the same time. That's the uniqueness represented by Shmini. Now the question is, that's very nice, But surely Hashem designed the world to be as it currently is, in other words, to obscure godliness. So why is that going to change? And surely that's the way it was intended. So how should it change? And we need to understand the way of the world today, that we do not see Elikus. We don't even see the degree of Elikus which powers our world. Forget about higher, lofty, infinite degrees of Elikus. We don't even see Koyach HaPoel Benifal. We don't see the pulsating energy of Hashem every single moment, keeping creation alive and pumping. So the fact that we don't see godliness now is not because there's some kind of an impediment. It's because that is the design of this world. It is designed that you don't see godliness. So if that's the case, then the fact that there's an obscuring of godliness, a blurring of godliness in our world as a feature of the essence, the nature of this world, that's why it's called Olam, because as we said at the beginning of the Sikha, the name of anything in Lashon HaKodesh represents its very essence. So Olam comes from the word Helam, which means to conceal. That means that its essence, its purpose is to conceal. So how is it logical then to say that in the time of Mashiach, my normal, natural human eye, which is part and parcel of the world, which is designed fundamentally to block godliness, to filter out godliness, how is it logically now going to become the apparatus by which I will see not just godliness, but ultimate godliness? Doesn't seem to make sense. So we'll explain this based on a quotation from Tanya, a quotation that should be familiar to every chassid, although the Rebbe is going to highlight something about this quotation that sometimes we overlook. The Rebbe explains that this incredible divine revelation that will occur in the time of Mashiach, and more so at the time of Tchias HaMesim, kol zman meshech hagolus. The Rebbe explains that is completely dependent on our actions and dedication to the Hashem's Torah mitzvahs through the course of Golus. Through the course of Golus. So why does the Rebbe have to say that it's reliant on our Torah mitzvahs through the course of Golus? In other words, there were Torah mitzvahs before there was Golus, and there will be Torah mitzvahs in the time of Mashiach. So why are we emphasizing Dafka through the course of Golus? What is it about Golus that gives us a different and special flavor to our Torah mitzvahs that creates the opportunity for this great revelation? Surely the way that we bring about this incredible revelation of godliness is through doing Torah and mitzvahs. The Alter Rebbe explains it right there and then in Tanya. He says every single time we do a mitzvah, we draw down an incredible revelation of Hashem's infinite godliness into this physical world. So there you have it. The mitzvah does it. Why is it reliant on golus? Surely mitzvahs are the key. Do mitzvahs reveal Hashem in the world? Why does the Alter Rebbe say specifically b'meshech zman hagolus, through the course of the golus? What's the connection to that time period? It's the facility of mitzvahs, the power of mitzvahs that brings about divine revelation in this world. It's not the time frame of golus, surely. So what are we missing here? So one possible answer, and of course, if a Rebbe says b'derech efshar, that is the explanation. It's just the Rebbe's chiddush. The goal is not just revelation. We made that point clear already. It's not good enough just for Hashem to reveal himself because he can, because he's infinite. Our eye has to see it in the most natural way. That's the goal. To infuse the physical with this incredible sense of the reality of godliness. So behechrech, if that's the case, then behechrech, there's no question. Shamshachas elikus shalidah mitzvahs. Shamshachas shetovei lidegil yasid lavei loy tiyeh kedavar noisef ba'olam. So then it's critical that the revelation we will achieve at the time of Mashiach, just as it is not superimposed over me, and it's normal and natural for my eye to see godliness in the time of Mashiach, likewise the elikus cannot be superimposed onto the world. It has to become a natural component of the natural world when Mashiach comes. Which means, so if I do a mitzvah, what happens if I do a mitzvah? There's a world. Inside that world, I do a mitzvah. By doing that mitzvah inside the world, I inject some elokus into the world. But the world is the world, and the mitzvah is a mitzvah, and the mitzvah channels an additional light into the world that doesn't naturally belong in the world. But really the goal is that a mitzvah should not just superimpose elikus onto the world, but that the mitzvah should reconstitute the world so that it becomes a place of godliness. Therefore, so that's why the Alter Rebbe emphasizes that the Giloi of Ein Sof, of infinite godliness, that will happen in the time of Mashiach, is contingent not only on mitzvahs, but specifically on mitzvahs performed during the period of Golus, because there's something about those mitzvahs that adds a quality to the experience of mitzvahs that makes them seep into the very fibers of this world, so that the world becomes a place of godliness, and not only becomes a place, but retroactively reveals that it was always intended to be a place of godliness. So what do we have in those mitzvahs that we do during the course of Golus that puts them at a different level to ordinary mitzvahs, let's say done during the time of the Beis HaMikdash? So let's first understand generally the idea that mitzvahs do not superimpose divine energy onto the world, but that they actually rewire the world to become a different reality. So to understand that, we know that Tachlis Bri'as Olam Bishvil HaTorah uBishvil Yisrael. We know very well that the entire purpose for which the world was created was for Yidden to fulfill Torah mitzvahs. Or to put it into different words, the entire purpose of creation is that we, via the channels of Torah mitzvahs, should reveal godliness in this world. Aha, so if that's the case, each time we do a mitzvah or learn Torah, and we now bring godliness into the world, it is fundamentally not superimposing. If the purpose of the world was, as we suggested originally, to block godliness, then every time you bring godliness into the picture, you're playing with the original reality and you're shifting it in an unnatural way. But as soon as we recognize that the entire purpose of creation was that we should reveal godliness in this world through Torah and mitzvahs, then every single time I do a mitzvah, I'm peeling away a layer to say that's actually what the world is really all about. That's in fact what it was intended for right from the beginning. Because seeing as we and the Torah we fulfill is the ultimate purpose for which the world was created, so it's effectively as if the world is demanding of us, do what this is all about. I'm only here as a stage. I'm only here as the props to allow you the opportunity to make you and I have a purpose. So the world's not getting in the way. The world isn't designed to interfere with Elikus. The world is designed to be in a default state of interference only so that we could reveal divine godliness, absolute infinite godliness in this world, and the world actually expects it of us. But that's not the end of the story. That's an insufficient explanation to really get the real depth of what's going on over here, and how we can understand that although the world appears to be designed with an obstacle or a blurring of godliness, actually it's there to reveal godliness. Now, the truth is that, as we've already described, the way that the world was created is to be Helem. That means its essential reality, at least now, is blockage of Elikus. Actually, if anything, the world, in its natural state, is designed, as we said before, to block Elikus. So it's all very well for us to say, the world is saying, please get past me. Overcome my obstruction and bring godliness into the world. That's all very nice, but the fact of the matter is, that's not what we said. We said that the world is a revelation of it, because where do you see that? Where do you see that? Where do you see that that's the purpose? It looks more like the purpose of the world is to interfere until we get the upper hand. So we're back to square one, because now it still seems to appear that the world has its reality and we have our challenge to overcome its reality, which means that we have the challenge to superimpose godliness onto the world. And we want to say that's not the case. So how? How do we say that's not the case? How do we say Shmini? How do we say that the objective is to get the highest, most unique, infinite element of godliness inside the world, when actually the presentation of how the world appears seems to be quite different? It seems to be that the world is stuck in the mud, and our job is to vault over it and then splash it with godliness to the point that eventually it succumbs to the overwhelming godliness. So the clue to all of that is what the Alter Rebbe alluded to when he said that it's not just about us earning divine revelation by doing Torah mitzvahs, but it is specifically by doing Torah mitzvahs through the period of Golus. So again, what is unique about doing mitzvahs during Golus? What's unique? What does it call forth from us to do a mitzvah during Golus? Once we understand that, we'll understand how it's really about making darkness shine. שבזמן הגולוס מאיר המסירות נפש יויסר מאשר בזמן הבייס. כי דווקא ההלם וההסתר בזמן הגולוס מאיר אז גילו כרך המסירות נפש. We do know this well because in Chassidus it says in many places that being in Golus and having all of the challenges that we do face during Golus, which are far greater than the challenges spiritually that we would have faced at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, elicits Mesiras Nefesh from us in a way that is unprecedented. So what is unique about Golus is not just doing Torah mitzvahs, but what it takes to do Torah mitzvahs, the sacrifice required to fulfill Torah mitzvahs. And I know we often think of Mesiras Nefesh specifically in the context of inquisitions and pogroms and a Holocaust, but the truth is that the Mesiras Nefesh required to do Torah mitzvahs in today's Golus, where there is a prevailing attitude in the world that discards so many of the morals and values of Torah, may be equally or perhaps even greater than that kind of Mesiras Nefesh. Either way you look at it, Golus presses us for Mesiras Nefesh. You don't just do Torah mitzvahs plain sailing. Even in the wonderful democratic realities that we live in, there's always something you have to fight for, and you have to fight really hard. And sometimes the battle is extremely subtle, so you really have to dig deep and find resources that you didn't necessarily expect that you were ever going to have to use. So, now the Rebbe asks a beautiful question. Logically, how can Helem, concealment, ever be the cause of Giloi, revelation? It doesn't seem to make sense. Surely if things are shutting down, then the impact should be shutting down. How does it work that a dark reality elicits a light response? Think of it in real life. If things are very overwhelming, the typical human response is to be depressed, anxious, angry. So how is it that when things are overwhelming, your response is going to be empowered? Doesn't seem to add up. Now you'll say, okay, look, the reality is that's how life works. Push people against the wall and they come back fighting stronger. Or as we say, where do you see the ultimate control of the human mind? In the least lively part of the human body, the heel. So there is this paradoxical reality, but still. Why, in fact, did Hashem design the world that you have Yisur Ha'or Min HaChoshech, that you have the olive producing its oil when it's crushed? Why did Hashem design a world where darkness and adversity is dafka what brings out the depth within us? Why? The explanation is fascinating. כדי שתסמלא כוונת הבריאה להסתיר לו יסברך בסחתינים, שהעולם עצמו יאדיר לקודש בריך גם מצד טבעו. Because the goal of existence is not to blast away the world with divine revelation, but rather to create a sense of divine revelation that is real and genuine, and yet inside the reality of this world, that my physical eye can see godliness in the most normal way. So that's the goal. So Hashem in His infinite wisdom designed the world in its current state to already reflect the future reality. What's the future reality? Absolute godliness in the least likely place. How's that going to happen? It's paradoxical. So Hashem already reflects that into the reality of our world. Seeing as the reason Hashem created a world of darkness is only to facilitate and precipitate much greater light and revelation afterwards, the value of light, not light that follows darkness, but light that emerges from darkness. So because the goal is that the darkness will elicit the highest degree of revelation, that's why the world, our physical world, like our eyes, is designed right from the beginning to be the ultimate receiver for absolute divine revelation. More even than Malachim. You would expect that Malachim should be better suited to great Giloi Lekus. No, my eyes that I usually use to watch the road when I'm driving, those eyes are best suited to accommodate Giloi Lekus in the highest form. So now that we understand that the purpose is already reflected in our world as it is now, not as it will be in its perfected state, as it is now in its fractured state, already reflects this theme. What is reflected in this world? That the world is dark only in order to facilitate the tremendous infinite light that we will produce through Torah and mitzvahs. So therefore, if the goal is that our world in its darkened state will be the trigger to illuminate infinitely, in simple language, the trials and tribulations of living in a dark world will force us to come out guns blazing and do so much more for our Yiddishkeit. So therefore, it turns out that the revelation at the end is going to be very much linked to this world. This world's not just a catalyst to be discarded at the end. It is a fundamental part of the process. It is the means by which Eloikus becomes revealed in this world. And so therefore, when that Eloikus is eventually revealed, the world is right there with it because it was the facilitator. It was the vehicle. So now it is the course of revelation. That's why the Alter Rebbe highlights that what's going to be revealed in the future, Ein Sof, Hashem's infinite radiance, is completely dependent on Torah mitzvahs, specifically through the course of Golus. Because when you have Golus, that's when you have pushback. That's when you have resistance. When you have resistance, that's when you have to dig deeper. Once you dig deeper, you find Mesiras Nefesh, which essentially means that my neshama is indelibly linked to Hashem and there's no way out. Which effectively means, actually, that the whole world is there to bring me to my deepest place. It's not there to obstruct. It's not there as an obstacle. It is there as a catalyst. So only when I see Mesiras Nefesh, only when I see the degree of commitment to Elikus that a person has because of Golus, then I recognize what Golus is for and what the world is for. It was only there in order to facilitate that Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore we understand why it is that Torah mitzvahs, specifically through the challenging times of Golus, has the most profound impact on the physical world. Ad sheliyosid lavoi yove adove begile shekim and igla kved avai berko basa yimitzat chunas uteva basar gufa, to the extent that it radically changes the experience we have of this world to the point that my eyes are able to see godliness. In other words, what we're saying over here is the whole Shmini paradox is the paradox of having something which is completely beyond the system and yet totally anchored within the system. And what's significant about that is that we're trying to illustrate that absolute elikus is anchored within the reality of our world. You want to get the greatest revelation of Hashem, you don't do that by meditating on a mountain or floating off in a nod of an avihu kind of an experience. You're going to get that absolute elikus by slogging away through the challenges of this world, because they are designed to release that depth within us. So now we can understand why we said right at the beginning that although Shmini follows consecutively and chronologically from the story of Parshas Tzav and the 7 days of preparation, it actually has much more to do with the story of the kosher and non-kosher animals, birds and fish at the end of the parasha than it has to do with its immediate neighbor and chronological part of the story. What happened in Parshas Tzav in the 7 days of preparing the Mishkan is that Aaron and his sons achieved everything that is humanly possible in terms of creating a space for Hashem. Which means that they were even able to bring down whatever degrees of Elikus human endeavor can reach. They perfected the 7-level series. They perfected whatever you could achieve of godliness in human terms. But all of that was only a preparation for what was going to happen on the 8th day, which is a radically different experience. Now it's Hashem coming down into the Mishkan in Hashem's terms. So what happens on the 8th day? What happens on the 8th day is now all of the effort that Aaron and his sons and the whole Bnei Yisrael made to prepare this Mishkan, all of that facilitates so that when the Elokus, which is beyond the world, enters on Yom HaShmini, it enters. It enters fully. So what's Parshas Tzav all about? Prep. Before you get to that great paradox, before you reach that incredible revelation of godliness inside the physical world. Whereas later on in the parasha we start to tell me which animals, birds and fish I may or may not eat. That's exactly on the theme of Shmini. It's not a prep for Shmini, it is the theme of Shmini. Why? Because remember, we said that the whole purpose of everything is that we should be able to serve Hashem in such a way that we create Giloy Elikus in this world. And not just any Giloy Elikus, but the ultimate Giloy Elikus, Ein Sof Mamash, to be revealed in this world. That means that we want to bring into this world a level of Elikus that is beyond anything that could be created or defined. And we're going to grab it and bring it into our reality. How? The only way it can happen is, we said, there has to be darkness. That's what we said. In order to facilitate us bringing about Giloy Elikus, there has to be darkness for us to fight. And what is darkness if not non-kosher food, non-kosher creatures that are wired to be impure? And in spite of their existence, and in spite of the fact that these things exist, they exist with a clarity. This is where we may go, this is where we may not go, these are the battle lines. This is where I have to have my personal Mesiras Nefesh, not to get caught up in that world. Like the famous saying of Chazal, that a person should never say, oh, I would never eat chazan. Never, I would never eat chazan. It's disgusting. I would never touch it. No, you're supposed to say, I would touch it. It's a battle. But I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to succumb because I'm dedicated to Hashem. The darkness is going to bring out my dedication. So to put it into different words, the minute I resist having something, even if I've never had the inclination, but I tell myself, I would perhaps eat that stuff, but Hashem says no. At that point, I bring Elikus into that realm as well. Into that incredibly dark space of this world. It now has Elikus in it. Interestingly, out of all of the mitzvahs in the Torah, it's specifically when it comes to laws of kosher and non-kosher animals, that's when the Medrash tells us that the purpose of all mitzvahs is to refine us. Interesting. Here we are talking about things that we'll avoid, but it's to refine not only us, but in fact the world around us as well. So taking this as an example, which represents all of darkness in the world, where Torah mitzvahs helps me to see the reflection within darkness of its purpose. I don't see darkness just as darkness, I see darkness as its purpose. In other words, every time there's that challenge, every time there's that darkness, I have no choice. I have to make a call. I have to make a statement to the world, or at least to myself, that I do what Hashem wants. Mesiras nefesh, completely in, boots and all. I'm absolutely dedicated. So what was the purpose of the darkness? Not to be dark, but to bring out that giloi within myself, and then giloi lekus in the world. So that nifal agili de Shmini. So that's what Shmini is. Shmini is when the world looks dark. Shmini looks when I have challenges, and I stand up to those challenges, and I remain steadfast, and I'm committed to Hashem. That illustrates, and not just to me, but to the whole world, a giloi elikus, a revelation of godness that is incredible, until the world itself becomes Shmini. It becomes this hybrid of absolute elikus, ein soif, in the here and now. The elikus is part and parcel of the normal world. You can see it with normal eyes, and there's no surprise. This will also help us to understand a very intriguing medrash that says that in the story of the non-kosher animals there's an allusion to various nations. Moshe ra'a es hamalchius bi Sukkon. The Medrash tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu saw all the shenanigans of the various nations of history in the story of the non-kosher animals. The Medrash goes through the various nations that persecuted the Jewish people and what the nature of their persecutions were, and the specific darkness associated with each. Why is that discussed here? Because now you see it all together. It's Parsha Shmini, the Parsha that illustrates how in the time of Mashiach there's going to be the revelation of this eighth dimension, which is completely beyond anything, but yet it will be absolutely at home in this world. Where do we talk about this? In the Parsha that speaks about so much darkness, because it's that darkness of Golus that precipitates and facilitates us being able to reveal this level of Elikus. Medrash, and the Medrash there concludes, fascinating. It says the chazer, the most objectionable animal that exists for Jewish people, the ultimate treif, represents who? Edom. Edom is the descendants of Esav. Why? Because that is the one that's going to return Jews to their greatness. That's why Edom is called a chazer, because he's going to bring Jews back to the greatness. The ones who persecuted us in the most brutal way for 2,000 years, more than any other of our enemies, from the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash to the gulags and the Holocaust. He's going to bring Jews back to our greatness. As the pasuk says, that the saviors will come up to the mountain of Zion, and they will judge the mountain of Esav, and then Hashem will reign supreme, which is of course talking about the time of Mashiach. Through our challenges, I think the take-home message of here is very clear. Very often in life, particularly in the modern world, we feel that challenges are overwhelming, and perhaps we have to just step down and not be so harsh on ourselves. And here the Rebbe is saying every single challenge is an opportunity to reveal the depth of our neshama, and ein soif, giloi elikus in this world, that it should become part and parcel of the reality of our world. We make Mashiach a reality every single time that we stand up to the challenges that we face spiritually.